Good morning, everybody. My name is Hans Graux. I'm a lawyer from Belgium, visiting from Brussels here today. So I'm very grateful that I could be at this event here this morning. In lovely Tallinn, I've had the opportunity of visiting a couple of times already. I've enjoyed every single one of them. I'm very grateful for the organizers for having me here. Also very grateful to the gentleman. I couldn't see you, I think you were over there, the e-resident, because at least that means there is a second other person who doesn't actually speak Estonian. It would be very awkward otherwise to realize that the translation actually would be here just for me. At least it's for the two of us now. That's a bit less awkward. So what I wanted to talk to you about this morning is a little bit about open data policies, open data changes in Europe, and particularly the role of GDPR. It's not only about the GDPR, because there are a couple of broader things, a couple of broader trends that are ongoing. Obviously, the GDPR is a very big one. I think the horizontal, the cross-cutting point is the role of data, of open data in our society. The old statement, the old cliche is data is the new oil. That's what people used to say, very valuable, drives the economy. I actually like it better when people say that data is the new green energy. The analogy is a lot better. Not just because of the environmental impact that, oil obviously has a much more negative role, but also the economics make more sense. Oil is scarce, if they get it out of the ground, and at some point you would run out. Green energy is not. The sun keeps shining, the wind keeps blowing. The same goes for data. Data is not scarce. The only thing about data is you need to know how to use it, how to extract value from it, monetize it, make money from it, but also create an added value for society. The analogy is also better because we've been using oil for a very long time now. We're very good at it, if you want to be cynical about it, in the sense that we know how to get it very cheaply and we know how to burn it on a large scale. So on that sense, we are good at it. Whereas green energy, we still need to do a lot more investment to get the real value out of it, to make sure that people use it and that it's economically viable. That's a much better analogy for where we are with open data. We've learned a lot. We're getting a lot better at using it. We're certainly not there yet, and we still have a lot of lessons to learn. So I like to think of open data as being the equivalent of green energy. There's also a lot of very good use cases around open data and green energy. Actually, I encountered a very small scale one in the town where I live. I live in a small town. I work in Brussels, but I live in a small town of about 10,000 people, a couple of kilometers outside of Brussels. And my local commune did a project recently where they basically they created heat maps from the entire territory of the community, of the entire city and the local communes, the regions where I live. Not a heat map in the sense of we measure how much activity is going on, but a heat map showing how much energy, how much heat is leaking from individual buildings to create eco-awareness, to show people, okay, look, here is a map with information showing you how much heat is flowing out of your house. If your house is green, it's pretty good. If it's yellow, a little bit not so good. If it's red, you know that investments are needed. That's a very big point also in the green energy debate, because in most countries, including Belgium, a lot of energy is wasted simply in heating up houses. Just simply the fact that you're heating your house inefficiently, it's improperly isolated. And that data was made publicly available. A lot of communes are doing that. And it's not to force people to take action, but at the very least, everybody, including myself, then gets curious and says, okay, at least once I'm going to take a look at this website and see how my house is doing compared to the neighbors. So that's always what you want to know. Is my house better or is it worse than the neighbors? It was actually amazingly detailed because the resolutions probably, the information was pasted on resolution comparable to what you would find on a Google Maps type overview. And you could actually see which side of your house was doing better. And it seemed to be pretty accurate because the spots in our house, at least that we were aware of already, were not that well isolated, showed up in red. So it got people thinking about, maybe we need to invest a little bit more to improve energy efficiency. It's useful as well because people who are working in this industry can use this to see, well, where do we need to target our promotions? Where are there problems? Where are the areas where houses are significantly worse isolated? And for governments as well, if they want to issue subsidies or premiums to get the work done, to get houses isolated a little bit better, this is the kind of information that they need to make progress. So that's a good example of open data having been generated can be made, can create a lot of value by making it publicly available. So that's very valuable. How are we doing on open data in the European Union? The source of this information is the same as in the previous information, so if the style looks familiar, don't be surprised. We have a European data portal that shows how much information from the public sector, this is public sector only, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, how much of that data is being made available and how well we are doing in general. So there's a new scoreboarding system. You've actually already seen the Estonian report in the previous presentation. If you look at what we're good at the European Union, where things are going sort of satisfactorily, it's the policy stuff. Legislation is more or less getting where it needs to be, providing good guidance on how licensing should work and what kind of policies where you need to focus on, what are the data priority areas. We're doing sort of okay on portals and on quality. I'll actually look a little bit more at the Estonian situation. You saw the overview slide in a moment. So the infrastructure is being built. Data is getting better. Still a couple of weak points where we need to look at, especially around the quality of data and the metadata being published with it. What we're very bad at is the impacts, actually identifying use cases and promoting those, and telling stories around that, measuring, are we improving the environment? Are we creating economic value? Are we getting social benefits? Very hard to measure that, and that's what we are doing bad at. Bad is a relative term. Europe as a whole still does pretty well compared to most other regions of the world, but that's a part where we could create a lot more benefit. Also important to know that this is not just some ideological discussion about what we want data to be used for or what kind of impacts we want to have. There have been a lot of efforts over the last couple of years to measure, euros, actual money, how much is this generating, how much are we putting into this, and how much are we getting out of that. You get different estimates depending on who you ask and depending on the methodologies. Obviously, that's always going to be the case. But there seems to be pretty strong consensus that the data that you find on these kinds of portals, public sector information being spread, right now contributes about, depending on where you look, on who you ask and how you measure it, about 60 to 70 billion euros per year to the European economy. That's pretty substantial already. That's just the public sector reuse elements. Like I said, it depends very much on how you measure it. To get those kinds of numbers, you have to assume that people who are using the public sector data really depend on it to generate turnover. You can always argue about how much, how big is the role of the data, how big is the role of the software, of the exploitation strategies of the people being involved. But generally, 60 to 70 billion euros per year, that's not exactly child's play. It's also, if you look at that portal, that's updated dynamically, so the number probably changed since I made the slides. There's ballpark about 800,000 data sets to be found on that website. That's also interesting because if you do the simple math, say that's 60, 70 billion euros for 800,000 data sets. That means that on average, people manage to generate about 100,000 euros of value per data set being made available. So when you're in doubt about what you should do, making data available seems to be generally a pretty good economic investment. So it's not just about looking at what ideologically would like to have, it's also something that generates money. Some data sets obviously are more valuable than others. Some are worth millions, some are worth virtually nothing. But on average, order of magnitude, 100,000 euros seems to be the value that a data set can create. The Estonian report, we already saw that in the previous slide already. Which was interesting to me because I do a lot of European policy studies, and any European policy study that you do that's e-government related, Estonia is always on the top. So frankly, when I looked at the open data statistics, I thought, okay, this is going to be pretty easy. Estonia is also going to be on the top here. For open data, it's actually not the case, like it was mentioned already. Estonia is in the follower group, not terrible, not doing great. Like I said in the previous presentation, a lot of that was also about the timing of the data collection. It was in early 2018, before a lot of the initiatives that were just discussed were implemented. So I hope and fully expect that the statistics will improve quite a lot. But most of the points where the Estonian open data policies suffered a little bit was lack of information on impact, so lack of good stories around use cases, where is this open data actually being used, how much value is being generated, and also the quality of the data and the metadata. So those are points that have been addressed in the meantime, and that hopefully will improve the scores in the next couple of years. It's also because the methodology has become a lot more strict. These kinds of reports, as you can imagine, are issued pretty much every year. Well, every year since 2015, so it's pretty relative, but they have been issued for a couple of years now. Estonia used to score a lot better. It's just with the methodologies that have been chosen now, you are penalized a lot more if you cannot provide information on the impacts of open data, and if you cannot provide assurances on how metadata is being handled. So those things are kind of strategically important. That's more of the background of the story. The main thing that I wanted to discuss very briefly here is what are sort of the main trends, what are sort of the main changes that you see in the European Union at the European level, but also internationally, because most of this isn't just about how the EU works. Obviously, and this is a very European story, one of the big changes, one of the big trends is the stronger emphasis, the stronger focus on data protection, on privacy protection. The GDPR now, we have a lot more focus on making sure that people's data isn't used inappropriately. The contact information question that we just got actually is a good example of that. Obviously, the government needs to be able to reach you, needs to be able to communicate with you. It's a tricky policy question on whether you also want to make the contact information from people publicly available. In principle, that's a very good thing. It creates transparency. It allows people to reach you more easily. Probably your address, your geographic address is going to be published anyway, so publishing your email address and your phone number only makes communication a lot easier. The downside is that it also makes it easier for people to abuse your data. And technology really has changed that story a lot. I know of one application, I'm personally a big fan of it, although it's a little bit controversial, an open data application in Belgium. A lot of countries have them, where you can type in the name of any person or any company and find out what other companies or other persons they're affiliated with or what kind of positions that they have. So I've tried it with my own name, and it correctly identifies that I'm a lawyer and have a management position in Time.lex, which is the law firm that I work for, which is perfectly fine. It also shows, for instance, that I have a management company, that I don't work personally for my law firm, but that I have a management company to organize my activities with, which is a little bit more of a gray area, because that's more of how I manage my internal finances. It's publicly available information. It's always been publicly available. It just didn't used to be easy to find. You would have to go through a lot of official journals and do a lot of official searching. With open data applications, you can find that a lot more easily. Obviously, this is also being used a lot to look at the activities of politicians. You can use this kind of interface, this kind of service as well, to find out about your favorite politician, what additional jobs they have beyond being the mayor of this or a minister in that department. You can find out what companies they are involved in, whether they are shareholders, whether they have management positions, how many jobs they have. I think the record holder in Belgium has 48 jobs, which you can discover through through an analysis like that, which seems like an awful lot. I like that because you have to have some accountability. And I think if we made the decision as democratically as a society that this information has to be publicly available, then it's okay that it's easily findable. But it does cause a lot of discussions, a lot of tensions, because of, people's sensitivities to these issues are different. We don't have one level of privacy sensitivity for any type of application. So data protection obviously is a big story. A second very big one is the fact that nobody is happy anymore with data just being published. If you look at the changes that we've had in the last 15, 20 years, 15 years ago it was revolutionary if you just published an Excel file once a year on your website and said, this is my open data policy. And we moved on from that and said, okay, it has to be more frequent. Then we had moved on and said, we have to have portals where you can find these more easily. And we've now moved on to the point where we said, no, this is the cloud computing age. We want data as a service. I don't want to have to download an Excel file or the CSV file or whatever. I don't want to download a file and integrate that. I want a nice API that's permanently available where I can request data. more focus on dynamic data sets, better data quality. For a lot of applications, it's always been the case. Like if you're working around mobility, transportation, if you want to use information about the train net or the bus net, then the Excel files don't really help you a lot. You want to see where's the train now? Is it delayed? You need a good API for that. Just being able to download files doesn't work for that. So there's a lot more focus on APIs. This is difficult, by the way, in the public sector in particular, because they're not used to providing services to the public. The data part used to be a side effect of what they're doing. They had their public sector function, their public task. The law said you are responsible for doing this thing. Oh, and by the way, the data that you have, you should make that available. Moving that to a data as a service model really changes the paradigm for these organizations a lot. They have to become a lot more dynamic. They have to reorganize the way they think and the way they work. They have to become a service provider to the public in a way that they never used to have to do. So that requires a lot of investment, a lot of training, a lot of education, a lot of awareness raising. Information security is an obvious one. I think we're all more concerned about where our data goes and what's going to be used for. We all have heard the big stories about data being made available. I think it's not a government data story, but just look at Facebook opening up its APIs and saying, okay, if you pay us enough money, then we'll give you information about the interests of specific citizens. You can select which ones you want, and then we'll show them political advertisements that are going to be perfectly targeted to their interests, which has led to very controversial stories about one single political party having different and sometimes contradicting publicity campaigns depending on who they want to target. You could say, I'm tough on immigration for people who probably look like they're going to want to be tough on immigration. You could say, well, we want more immigration because it's better for the economy, for people who have that preference. And open data allows that as well. So this is another one of those areas where you have to be very sensitive about how data is going to be used and abused. Big data, artificial intelligence, deep learning, scientific research, those are obviously very big ones. The question was raised about healthcare. This is the big game changer for healthcare. The traditional health research, as it's been done by academic institutions and by pharmaceutical companies, clinical trials, they can only go so fast. With traditional methodologies, there's a limit to how quickly you can go, because you need to set up a protocol, you need to find patients, you need to conduct tests, you need to collect the data, you need to do the analysis. And you have to do that within the organization, within the geographic region that you're working on. It's pretty limited. If you apply these new paradigms, if you can apply deep learning, if you can use artificial intelligence on a broad range of data sets, you can make a lot more progress. But it does require that you get access to a lot of patient data. This is the part where a lot of hospitals, a lot of patients, a lot of citizens, and a lot of policymakers reasonably get nervous and say, I don't know about this. This is patient data, it belongs to the patients. Sure, we want better healthcare and we want better research. We're not entirely sure how we're going to encourage deep learning, how we're going to encourage scientific research without throwing the data, without throwing patient records on the streets. Yes, you can anonymize data, you can pseudonymize data, you can try to tinker with it a little bit to protect privacy, but it still remains a complex issue. So this is one of the big issues that we're struggling with. Beyond that, we're also tackling intellectual property rights reform. We've been doing a lot of work in the last couple of years on providing better open data licenses that are more tailored to the European context, that remove as many constraints as possible. We have many years ago already, the European Union introduced database rights. In addition to copyrights, we have database rights in the European Union. I think it's fair to say that that hasn't been a very big success and hasn't been very useful in encouraging innovation. So we're looking now at how we can redraft the legislation, how we can make that a little bit more flexible to facilitate the use of intellectual property rights, including, for instance, by defining exemptions and saying you can use open data for research purposes. You don't need a permission from copyrights holders or for intellectual property rights holders if you're going to be conducting research on it. And finally, free flow of data. That's a very big buzzword in the European Union. We want to make sure that at least within the European Union, people don't fight hard to keep data within their national borders. That's a very small victory at the international level, if you look at that. But there is still historically a tendency to keep some data within your national borders and to say, well, I, as a country, I want to make sure that all of this data stays nationally, stays within my borders so that I can keep tight control over it. That's not very conducive to having a good, innovative economy. So that's another big policy shift that we've seen. And all of this really has taken place over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I don't think there's anything there that's really much older than that. The discussions are a lot older, but the shifts in policy are pretty recent. So this is, it is something that actually changes quite quickly. And if you look at what's, very briefly, if you look at what's being done with that, with those big trends from a policy perspective, well, from the data protection perspective, obviously we have the GDPR, new data protection laws that aim to better protect people's privacy. And if you don't know anything else about it, the main thing you should remember about it, GDPR focuses on accountability. It gives you some margin of flexibility, but the bottom line is whatever you do with personal data, you have to be able to justify, to explain what you've done. You have to be able to show what kind of measures you've taken to avoid privacy incidents and personal data risks. You have to justify why your data protection measures, why the technical measures, security measures that you've taken, why those were reasonable. You have to be able to explain why you actually needed that data. Couldn't you have removed some of it? Did you need names? Did you need identification numbers for specific persons? Could you maybe make the data a little bit more vague and to make sure that you still get the value out of it without harming people's data protection rights? And we get more guidance at the European level on how this legislation needs to be applied in specific contexts. There's guidance, very old guidance on how data protection legislation is supposed to work in an open data context, or rather in a public sector information context, but also on how anonymization works, on how artificial intelligence should work, and so forth. Specifically for public sector information, the rules on that are being redrafted. As many of you will be aware, we have a public sector information directive that's already been rewritten once, and it's in the process of being rewritten a second time in a way that very much focuses more on enabling dynamic data, that focuses on lowering costs, because practices there in member states still vary quite a lot. Some of member states still focus very much on how much value, how much money they can extract out of licenses. We there want to make sure that the costs drop a lot more. It's more focus on portals, on dynamic data, on APIs. A lot of discussion also has been mentioned in the previous slides on high-value data sets, which is also a pretty big step forward. This is actually the first time that the European Union says some of this data is so important for society that member states shouldn't have the right to say, I'm keeping this private, I am not sharing this. For instance, on transportation and mobility information, but also for smart energy grids, it's very important to make sure that that data does not stay locked up within a specific company. If we want, I mentioned it in the introduction already, if we want the green energy transition to work, if we want to have more green energy, then it has to be possible to do better load balancing. Then you have to be able to see at the house level how much energy is being produced there, how much is being stored, how much can be stored in order to optimize your network. That doesn't work if a company can say, well, I'm the energy company, I put the meter there, it's my data and nobody else gets it. If we want to get innovation there, if we want to have apps in your house that you can use to see how much energy you're consuming and when you want to put on your dishwasher or whatever, if we want those kinds of applications to exist, then that data needs to be made publicly available. These reforms are all about that, about saying this kind of information you cannot keep behind. You cannot put that behind bars and say, I'm the energy company, it's my data, nobody else gets it. So that's a big step forward as well. There's also a lot more emphasis there on helping the member states. I mean, the mere fact that there's a European data portal is a very small thing, and right now you think of that as a given because it's been there for years already. But a couple of years ago, even that was a big innovation. And now that's a portal that tries to help member states build APIs, to build services. And it also tries to provide them with some guidance on how to address licensing challenges. It's a new project that's been recently started up, wants to act as a support center to member states for sharing data. So if you have a question, if you say, okay, I have some data, I want to make it available, but I don't know how. I don't know, technically how I have to do it. I don't know what kind of licensing terms I have to apply. I don't know if any kind of monetization strategy would make sense for me. Then there's a support center that will be available, just initiated, so they'll be active in a couple of months, that will be available to help member states with those questions. So that's a big one as well, to try and push that forward. On the security front, we now have a Cybersecurity Act that's been finalized, not yet published. That focuses a lot more on giving resources to a European agency called ENISA on conducting actual security exercises. So it's no longer just about exchanging policy documents and best practice information between governments. It actually wants to do exercises, cyber defense drillings, simulations of attacks against countries or against infrastructures to help countries prepare. And it also introduces a mechanism for cybersecurity certification. So you can get a certificate that products that are services that are put on the European market are safe and meet with European security requirements. That's a big one as well. For scientific research, artificial intelligence and deep learning, there the policies are a lot more tentative and experimental, I would say. There's no legislation coming, there's no deep learning law or artificial intelligence law or robotics law, simply because legislators also look at it and say, we don't know whether we actually need laws about this. We don't know how we need to solve these problems. What you do have there is basically organizations and different initiatives that look at what's going on. What are the big use cases? What are the threats? What are the problems that we're seeing? And what do we need to do? And just to give two simple examples, I think 2 weeks ago, so all of this is all very, very recent. 2 weeks ago, a paper was published on artificial intelligence guidelines. So if you want to build an artificial intelligence application or service driven by open data, and you're not entirely sure whether you've looked at the right questions from a policy perspective, from an ethics perspective, and even from a legal perspective, there's a guideline on artificial intelligence applications that's been made available by an expert group at the European level. If you read it, feel free to Google it, it's publicly available. If you read it, probably you're not going to be astonished. There aren't any breakthrough, innovative insights that you never could have thought about yourself. But it is interesting because it's a paper that formalizes a consensus. It's a good checklist if you're working with deep learning applications, with artificial intelligence, and you're basically wondering, have I thought about this well enough? That kind of document is very useful to double check whether you've done your homework. There's also a lot more proactive work. For instance, I don't know if there are people in here who participate in European-funded research projects, but there's a requirement, if you want to get European funding now, that the data sets that you generate or collect in those projects have to be made publicly available so that people can check your work, which really, it's so common sense that you wonder why this had to be an initiative to begin with. If it's taxpayer-funded, of course, the data should be made available with the public so that research institutions can double-check it. But still, that's a requirement that only was introduced a couple of years ago. And that's a big one, and it's an important one. Just saying to those research organizations that, yes, you can have the money, but the data has to be shared with the public and with other research institutions so that they can double-check your work and they can build on it. That's a very important part as well. We have open access policies specifying that the data has to be made available, under which conditions it has to be made available. Those are also the kinds of things that can help drive a data economy. For copyright, I mentioned already, we have a new directive. I think those of you who have heard about the directive have probably heard most about the legendary Article 13, which is the only article that ever gets discussed, even in the general press. That's the article that forces, to summarize a little bit, that forces organizations like YouTube to have a filter for copyright materials that makes it harder to use information for parodies and so forth. That's the more controversial part of copyright reform right now that I'm personally not that happy about, but okay. But that the legislation also contains new exceptions to copyrights for research purposes. If you want to conduct research on information, you don't need to get the permission from any copyright holder. This was also seen as a very important step forward to make it easier to actually use existing information and use existing data, at least trying to reduce a little bit the copyright barriers. There's a couple of elements in the legislation that make it a little bit harder to work with, but it's at least, it's good that at least after a couple of years of discussions, we have arrived to a consensus that Research is a good thing. We want to encourage more of it, and copyright shouldn't stand in the way of that. At least on that principle, we agree. On the details, it's a little bit sketchy still, but that's a good principle. And finally, we have a free flow of data regulation that basically tells member states that they cannot have national laws saying this data has to stay within my national borders. You have to use a server that's located in my country. There are obviously a couple of exceptions to that for cases where member states need to be able to inspect the data, for instance, in a banking context. But actually, those are very narrowly scoped. So in most cases, if a member state has legislation saying this data has to stay within my national borders, that legislation has to disappear. That's an important change as well. So there's actually a lot of valuable inputs that came out of that. For data protection, I already mentioned it. It's a lot more operational. We're teaching people to conduct data protection impact assessments, so formalized exercises to check whether they've asked the right questions and whether their use case, whether their use of open data that contains personal data that identifies people, whether they've asked the right questions and implemented the right measures. And implementing the right measures can be things like anonymizing or pseudonymizing data, reducing the granularity to make sure that people cannot be identified too easily, just making sure that the information that you have published, personal data that you're publishing, is appropriately protected. General message is not that if it's personal data, then you cannot make it available as open data. It only means that you need to apply some safeguards. I already spoke a little bit about data as a service, so the fact that we're now focusing a lot more on making information available through APIs rather than as downloads, and that there's a lot more emphasis on building open ecosystems. And this can even be at the sector level. The health issue was mentioned already. A lot of countries are building e-health networks, e-health repositories where patient data can be stored centrally. For now, that's with the purpose of just making it more easily accessible to doctors across different hospitals, but there's nothing stopping them from using that data later on for scientific research. Well, nothing stopping them. Data protection law obviously will be a big barrier to doing that in practice, but at least the collection of that data is improving a lot. And I already spoke a little bit about science and innovation. So where does that leave us? Wrapping up, how are we really doing when it comes to open data? I hope it's clear from the presentation that a lot has changed, not just in the economy of the data and the value of it, but also the way our policymakers and our legislators are looking at it. And a lot of that is just clearly beneficial and going in the right direction. The focus on data as a service, on APIs and portals, that's a no-brainer. Everybody is happy with that. That's just public sector following the way that the private sector is working. It's open data as a cloud. That's essentially the paradigm, so that's going pretty well. Some things are not going that well. Europe is not doing well when it comes to scientific research and mandating openness, making sure that data is freely available for everybody. Why is it not going so well? Basically, these are areas where there hasn't been, say, a political consensus to harmonize the rules at the European level. If you look at the GDPR, for instance, member states are still allowed to introduce national rules on scientific research, on historical research, on statistical research, and a lot of member states have done that. That means that if you're a company who wants to do research across the European Union, you're in trouble. It's hard. It's very hard. It's very expensive. You still need to look at national rules. There, we haven't found a good solution yet. At a minimum there, we need to work harder to build a better consensus. On the ugly part, things that don't work very well yet, GDPR best practices are not very well harmonized yet. Metadata of data sets aren't where they should be yet. There's still a lot of economic improvement necessary, and we aren't really very well capable of measuring how much economic impact all of these applications have. These are observations at the European level, and I think this is where I also want to wrap up the presentation. All of this is true at the European level. All of this is true also in most member states. All of this is also an opportunity if you want to distinguish yourself. For Estonia, as a very innovative, tech-oriented country that's capable of rapidly deploying and reforming itself, this is actually also a good list of action points. If you look at things, where can we do better than the rest of Europe? Where can we show that we are a data economy? It's these kinds of points, making sure obviously that your portal is working well, that the metadata is there, the services are there, the APIs are better, but also looking at how you can make it easier to make data available for scientific research purposes. Now, it requires alignment with a lot of industries, with just manufacturing industries, healthcare, academia, and the government itself. But if you can provide a healthier ecosystem there that removes some barriers, that makes it easier for companies to innovate, you can further unlock value there. That would improve the situation in Estonia, and hopefully the rest of Europe would take notice and would say, that seems to be working in Estonia, let's try to do that at the European level as well. So just the horizontal message, I think that's fair to say a lot of great work has been done. Open data is a lot more mature now than it was 5 years ago, even than it was 3 years ago. We're not fully there yet. We have still some open items, some open action points to get there. And I think there the analogy can go back to the green energy part. We know fundamentally how to do this. The technologies are there. It's just a matter of refining it, implementing it, and making sure that people in their day-to-day lives can get the benefit of it. And that's really all I wanted to say about that. Thank you. I don't know if you have time for questions before we go to the panel, or if there are any questions.
Yeah, I think we can take a few questions that are directly at you. Nii et kui on küsimusi eesti keeles, inglise keeles, on sulle siis palun, muidu me jätkame paneeliga. Kohe tuleb mikrofon ka.
Okay, one question. One of your slides pointed out that there is a growing love for self-regulation, co-regulation. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What are the incentives for different parties involved to engage in self-regulation or co-regulation? Is it fear of top-down regulation, or is it something else? Thank you.
It is. I think it's double. So from a policymaker, they're introducing more and more laws where they're encouraging codes of conduct, certification schemes being written by the industry itself, simply because, and this is actually comparable to the AI situation, if you're a legislator, if you write laws and you look at that situation, you say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm seeing some problems. I'm having some trouble coming up with a good solution. And I don't know if I have to legislate even. What I would prefer to do is encourage industry to talk to each other and to write up the rules themselves. You see this, for instance, well, in the GDPR, you have rules for drafting up codes of conduct, which have to be written by industry and for certification. But also in the Cybersecurity Act, which might be a little bit surprising because that's about safeguarding information security at the policy level. But even that legislation encourages industry to come up with its own standardization schemes and making proposals for that. And not mandating certification for products, but simply encouraging the industry to say, well, this might make sense for you. It is sometimes done by industry with a gun to their heads. That's fair to say. I think specifically for the cybersecurity certification, but also for the free flow of data regulation, which also has provisions on codes of conduct. The message from legislators is very clear. Look, there is a problem. We would like you to fix it as an industry. And if you don't, we reserve the right to make you solve the problem by legislation, which you might not like. So we'd prefer for you to govern yourselves and to come up with appropriate rules yourselves. We will be watching. If you don't do it, and if you do it in a way that we don't think is appropriate, we will legislate. I don't like phrasing it like that, because it's not accurate in all situations, and also because I'm personally a big believer of self-regulation and co-regulation. In some cases, it's like that the government wants to force it a little bit. In most cases, I think there's more of a goodwill, a general interest from the industry to work with the regulators, not just to avoid legislation, but to a large extent because they're all facing the same problems. If you're an IT company, if you're a bank, if you're a research organization, you all have to deal with the same problems. And it would be beneficial that you have a baseline across your industry where you can say, okay, if I'm going to follow these rules, probably I'm okay. Probably I'm not going to get punished for doing it badly. And that's, I think, a bigger incentive than the government push.